1913, ADL has been committed to its timeless mission of stopping the defamation of Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment to all. Consistent with this founding mission, in 2018, ADL launched the Task Force on Middle East Minorities with the mission of educating and advocating and elevating issues of impact, often overlooked minorities communities across the Middle East, including religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities, and others who face governmental and societal repression and discrimination. Let me take this opportunity to introduce our panelists. Farnaz Esfahani is a member of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities and a senior fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute. She also served as a member of the parliament in Pakistan. Her most recent book, which she will be discussing with us today, Politics of Hate, Religious Majoritarianism in South Asia, was published in 2023 from HarperCollins. We will also be joined today by Sam Tadros, who's a scholar working on the Middle East issues and is a member of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. We will also be joined by Aykan Erdemir, ADL's Director of Global Research and Diplomacy and a former member of the Turkish Parliament. Today, we will begin with the book launch of Farnaz Esfahani's book, Politics of Hate, Religious Majoritarianism in South Asia. Following a discussion of Farnaz's book, our expert panelists will explore the effects of religious majoritarianism across the Middle East. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator, George Saleen, the co-chair of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities and ADL's Senior Vice President of National Affairs. George?
Thank you, Marjan. Thank you for that introduction. Farnaz, so good to see you. Tuba, thank you for helping kick us off, and it's good to be with you all today. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and I'm especially excited to hear about some of the background and the context that Farnaz led you to write this really important work. And so, if I can, I'd like to start out by asking some questions to set some context for the listeners here today. So, Farnaz, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the genesis here. What prompted you to write The Politics of Hate? And in as short as you can tell us, like, what is the primary argument or thesis you're making in this book?
I've been, as most of us in the task force, have been working in the field of international religious freedom for many years. And in my time working with religious and persecuted minorities, and advocating on their behalf made me acutely aware of the relationship between politics and religious persecution. I was born in Pakistan and I also served in its parliament. Pakistan has the world's worst blasphemy laws, which are used to target minorities. And as we speak, these laws are being made more stringent with support from ostensibly liberal political parties. Pakistan's also the only country in the world that amended its constitution at one point to define who is a Muslim, just to exclude a specific sect. So here we see the blasphemy laws, anti-Ahmadiyya laws, have all been instituted as part of Pakistan's Islamization, which has been an instrument of generating political support in a country that's already 97% Muslim. So observing all this has made me very aware of how religious extremism is fanned for political reasons. In recent years, Pakistan's neighbor, India, where the ruling party rallies support from the majority Hindu population, does that by mobilizing antipathy towards minority Muslims and Christians. So India's BJP party builds the argument that the religious minorities are privileged at the expense of the majority, and that somehow justifies targeting them or making policies excluding them. So basically, these politics of scapegoating minorities to get support from majorities or majoritarianism is now the norm across South Asia. In addition to India and Pakistan, it can be seen in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. My new book, Politics of Hate, includes essays by a group of experts from each of these countries and looks at how hate sells and brings political advantage while persecuting religious minorities.
Farhnaz, you made a really important point on this topic of majoritarianism. And in the book, you really note the marked increase in majoritarianism across the globe. Can you help the viewers here understand how you describe majoritarianism? How is it that they should understand it? And more importantly, what are really the dangers of majoritarianism that you started to talk about, both in Pakistan and Southeast Asia and elsewhere across the globe?
Thank you, George. I see that the space for genuine secularism is shrinking throughout South Asia and across the globe, and that it is being replaced by what I use the term majoritarianism, which is spreading and has become a global phenomenon. So you see genuine multicultural societies, genuine secularism shrinking and being replaced by majoritarianism. Majoritarian political parties cultivate a sense of grievance among the majority, that its position is somehow threatened by the minority. And this phenomenon is the product of majorities, whether they're ethnic, racial, or religious. And they do that by, telling the masses, the leaders tell the masses and the voters in their countries that minorities are somehow privileged, and then the majority status and power, and in some cases existence, is threatened by the minorities. George, as you know, the US today is witnessing a rise in white grievance politics. And, that has also spilled over in Islamophobia, a rising anti-Semitism, and many other issues. And this is in the United States of America. So, and also in Western Europe, ethnic majorities in several European countries are expressing resentment against immigrant minorities. So in South Asia, the area I call home, the phenomenon of majoritarian is more religiously based. And basically the political leaders, religious leaders, and even military leaders in South Asia have used ethnic and religious sentiments against minorities to mobilize support from the majority. So this is, the minority is painted as the other against who the majority can be mobilized. And any number of arguments can and are invoked to explain why the majority's social, economic, or cultural position is under threat and why its dominance is necessary. To close up this explanation, I would say, to believers in majoritarianism, they are simply taking steps to respect or protect the majority's beliefs, rights, or sentiments, even when these appear rather extreme to everyone else. So majoritarianism is also often presented as a simple function of democracy, ignoring the fact that democracy is meant to protect the rights of minorities as much as a majority. So you see all over the world now, all these elected autocrats using majoritarianism and using this guise of democracy by saying we have the popular we have the popular vote, we have the popular mandate, and ignoring really the essence of democracy, which means all citizens are equal, no matter what their ethnicity is, or no matter what their religion is. So basically, in a nutshell, we see that Hindu majoritarianism in India tends to view the Muslim minority as a fifth column and often portrays them as being sympathetic to Pakistan. Christians are denigrated as remnants of a colonial legacy. And in Pakistan and Bangladesh, the Hindu minority and groups such as the Ahmadiyya Muslims are portrayed to the threats of the beliefs of the majority. And so hating the other is easier than addressing complex socioeconomic problems, and the result of majoritarianism is an increase in attacks on minorities and their loss of rights.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. I want to stick with the theme that you've outlined of majoritarianism. And Sam, if possible, I'd like to bring you into the conversation to offer a different kind of regional view on how these issues are playing out. I want to transition to a lot of the work that you've done in Egypt specifically, Sam. And I wonder if for the start of the question, you could kind of quickly summarize the plight of minorities in Egypt at a very high level, but then more importantly, and just kind of set the scene for our viewers here, but then tell us how religious majoritarianism really affects those minority communities really across Egypt.
Thank you, George, and it's a pleasure to be participating in this important discussion. Farhnaz outlined both the rise of majoritarianism or ethnic and racial politics in many Western countries, as well as that of religious majoritarianism in Southeast Asia. I think in a sense, in the Middle East, we've combined both, or we've had the two waves taking place in our region. First, it came in the form of Arab nationalism, or the post-colonial state, which began really by the exclusion of the other. In that case, it was the Jews. So the Nasser regime's exclusion of Jews, especially, as well as other foreigners, and an attempt to build hate towards Jews, towards Israel, as a means to solidify the new emerging state. And that model was not only in Egypt, but was also repeated, in a sense, across the region by all those regimes that mimicked Nasser in Algeria, in Syria, in Iraq, and other countries across the region. But today we've had, in a sense, the second wave, where it's not largely the governments that are doing this spreading of hate and intolerance, but it is other political players attempting to topple these regimes. So we see both the incitement at the hands of Islamist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups, not necessarily in violent actions, but in the constant incitement that is done against religious minorities, as well as seeing the state's role in terms of appeasement. When the Egyptian regime, for example, does not allow the building of churches in an area because the majority of the people in the area doesn't want it, it's basically appeasing that sentiment among the population. When they attacks on minority groups, especially the Copts in the south of Egypt, and they refuse to bring the perpetrators in front of courts, then they're also practicing this politics of appeasement in order to maintain their control on the population and compete or out-Islamize, in a sense, the Islamists, or take the ground away from them. We've had in the last month, there's a new case of blasphemy in Egypt, where a Coptic student in university is writing on social media, he's talking with someone on social media, and the other person insults his religion, so he insults back. And guess what? Guess which of them is now in trouble, has been suspended from university, and is going to be put on trial? Well, it's definitely the one belonging to a religious minority and not the majority. So while we find the role played by Islamists in terms of inciting that hatred, the role of governments is also very important in appeasing that in order to satisfy the mob.
Thank you, Sam, for that answer. I want to come back to a couple of those themes in a moment. But as we continue to expand this conversation, really on the themes, Farhnaz, that you so rightfully and eloquently point out in the book, I want to bring my colleague Aykan Irdemir into the conversation as well to just expand the scope of this topic just slightly. Aykan, one of the, or a pillar rather, of majoritarianism is really understood as the systemic scapegoating of religious minorities, as both Sam and Farhnaz have outlined in both the Pakistan, India, Egypt context, etc. I wonder, Aykan, if in your work, both professionally and academically, you could outline for us the political, social, and economic ways in which you've observed majoritarian regimes benefit from that scapegoating. I mean, I think Sam just kind of outlined a good example where a court system and there will be some judicial punishment in a punitive way against a student. Can you kind of help bring to light some examples like that you've observed either as a lawmaker or in your academic or professional context? And frankly, like the conversation that we should all be having with one another who care about these issues deeply are what are some of the counter strategies that we can be thinking about for religious minority communities and their allies to push back on this type of scapegoating. So if you can for us, share some examples and then some opportunities that we can collectively work with communities or individuals like that both Sam and Farhnaz pointed out to help escape this type of targeting.
Thank you, George, for this great question. It's really such an honor to be at Farhnaz's book launch event here. I'm a huge fan of her work, and I'm delighted to join our ADL task force colleagues as well. Let me begin by Farhnaz's book itself. In her introduction, she aptly recognizes a desire for religiously purer communities. Now, this not only applies to Pakistan, but to a long list of countries in South Asia and the Middle East. And such a drive toward religious and or sectarian homogeneity in the region almost always deploys scapegoating as a key strategy. Blaming religious minorities, whether they're Christians, Jews, Muslims, Baha'is, Hindus, or Buddhists, doesn't matter, is a step first toward systematic exclusion and ultimately toward demographic engineering or ethnic cleansing. And, I used to be a lawmaker in Turkey, a country which painfully lived through such a transformation, such a demographic transformation, built on the ashes of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious failed empire. The Republic of Turkey, just like many of the examples in Farhnaz's book presents, was a secular nationalist project which failed and ended up being a religious majoritarian project, like many others. Now, I see a significant level of rational calculations by the political elite to be at the root of such policies, such majoritarian policies, although those policies are often characterized by, journalists and policymakers and scholars as, politics of irrational hate and prejudice. So I'm very interested in the rationality behind such irrational politics. And I will turn to the chapter in Farhnaz's book written by Hussein Haqqani, which summarizes this dynamic really succinctly by saying, generating hate is an easy way to garner votes, end quote. Now, as a former politician, sadly and unfortunately, I have to agree with Hussein that really for politicians across the political spectrum, generating hate has been an easy way to garner votes, which tells us there's a significant level of self-interest on the part of the political elite in mobilizing such hate and prejudice. The history of anti-Semitism is one great example to prove that this dynamic is really ageless in a way. It dates back several millennia. And I would also like to add that we shouldn't just focus on the political elite, and never underestimate the self-interest at the level of middlemen and middlewomen of hate, as brokers of hate, as well as the public self-interest at the grassroots level. Again, to give an example from Turkish history, in 1942-43, when the Turkish Republic institutionalized a wealth tax, which disproportionately hit Christian and Jewish minorities, it was not just the state feeding on the spoils of the minority wealth, but it was also the public at large partaking in such pillaging and looting of minority resources. So I argue that majoritarianism accrues dividends to almost all adherents of such hate, prejudice, and scapegoating. And I also say hate has its eyes on capital, not just land, property, and wealth owned by minorities, but even the cultural capital of the minority elites, because majoritarianism comes with a new ascendant elite in the making, and they want to replace what they see as minority elite in positions of power and authority. Now, to cut a long story short, let me try to move on to how to push back, because ultimately I'm talking about a vicious cycle, right? A failed majoritarianism turning to majoritarianism to cover up its responsibility, to deflect blame for its economic bankruptcy, for corruption, for social and moral bankruptcy, and offering scapegoating of minorities as the way out. How do you push back against such a vicious cycle? How do we turn it into a virtuous cycle that is a chain of events in which one desirable outcome leads to another, which then reinforces the first one, so resulting in a continuous process of improvement? I always begin with agency. That is, it's really important that we have moral courage demonstrated by public figures such as Farah Naz in the case of Pakistan, for example. When you have individuals speaking up and against majoritarianism and hate and prejudice and scapegoating. And then the next step is building of inclusive alliances around such, courageous public figures. That is, alliances that bring together majority and minority communities, that offer an alternative, an inclusive, pluralist alternative that offers, instead of looting and pillaging of minority wealth, a work ethic, an ethic that revolves around producing and equitable sharing of national resources. And third, of course, given many of the societies that we talk about in the Middle East and South Africa have relatively weak domestic democratic dynamics, there is also the importance of solidarity from the free world. That is, advocates, policymakers, journalists, really spending time and resources demonstrating their solidarity with such morally courageous public figures and decision makers in the region. I know this is just a start, but these are three important steps just to get the ball rolling.
Icon, thank you for that overview. I appreciate the theme of getting the ball rolling, but I want to stay for just another moment on the theme of solutions and where we can start in that regard. And Farhnaz, I'd like to turn back to you on the topic of solutions for just a moment. You allude to a number of them in the book, and I think you've picked up on a number of themes that Icon also started to describe. But I guess the simple way to start the question is, what needs to be done? There seems to be a collective understanding on the nature and scope of the problem, and your book helps in great deal describe that. But what can both governments and states do to ensure the inclusion of minorities and marginalized communities? If the folks on this panel and if individuals who similarly think along these lines across the globe see this as an emerging trend and they're able to influence lawmakers and parliamentarians, what do they need to be asking for and advocating for to ensure safety from the state or from central governments?
Well, I think this is such a crucial thing. And I think Ekan, from his experience legislating on these issues, and myself and all my other colleagues who work in these sectors, basically the number one way is to combat exclusion by creating legal and social mechanisms against it. Unless you have laws and social mechanisms for those minorities, for those excluded and otherized to turn to, there is going to be no beginning. Now, obviously, it'll take a lot of steps and a lot of work for people to come together, like Ekan talked about, like groups coming together, coalition building. But combating exclusion by creating legal and social mechanisms against this is the first thing that needs to be done. Secondly, stop letting people advocate exclusivity of any kind in the name of freedom of speech. Now, it's such a tricky concept, freedom of speech, especially for those of us, who either live in America or are American and understand freedom of speech in a certain way. But finding ways to disallow people to advocate exclusivity on any kind in the name of freedom of speech is crucial. Hate speech needs to be identified in time and stopped. Above all, I think inclusivity needs to be part of one's education. Now you see this tampering of textbooks, etc., that we're seeing in America. That's actually something that those of us in the rest of the world have been seeing, witnessing, and really seeing how it's crippled our societies. It's absolutely taken away children's abilities to understand what these issues are. It's brainwashing. So inclusivity needs to be part of an educational process. People need to understand the concept of equal citizenship. No ifs and buts should be allowed. And these are all areas where, whether you're in Congress or parliaments around the world, or you're working in civil society, these are the kinds of things which coalitions have to be built across. Conspiracy theories, which again, Ekan brought up. Conspiracy theories are another instrument of hate. For example, such and such community will dominate us if we do not discriminate against them. So-and-sos are always doing this. You don't know them, but I understand what they're all about. So these are often the preface of prejudice. Prejudice breeds hate. Hate leads to exclusivity. So we must remember that hate is learned behavior. People do not hate the other instinctively. People are taught to hate. It is a process of otherization, us versus them, that creates fear, anxiety, and eventually hate. And another crucial step, I would say, in dealing with hatred, seeking solutions, is being aware and creating awareness. And I know, for example, Marjan does so much of that with her organization she's founded, and so does Sam, and so does everyone on this task force. Because there are many people who see nothing wrong in what they see as the majority asserting itself. The truth is, protecting minorities is an important element of democracy, of protecting human rights. And there's a lot of denial when this comes to religious persecution, but it has to be rooted. We have to root our arguments in the defense of human rights. And that is the umbrella, I think, that is really important, and it will be the most successful for those who either have no interest in religion and those who I just want their religion to be preeminent. So, sorry.
No, finish your thought, please.
Okay, so my final thought on this is that religion-based politics always leads to vigilantism and violence, ultimately. It promotes sectarianism. And in any case, it's a violation of the UN Charter of Human Rights that allows people to have and practice any faith or have none. So these are all different ways, I feel, George, that, you know, we can unify and build coalitions around some of these ways.
So Farhnaz, I want to come back to who should be reading the book and how they should be reading it and applying it in their countries and in their communities. But I want to come back to that in a second. But Sam, I want to bring you into this kind of closing round of conversations. And I want to really echo the theme that Farhnaz outlined of inclusion. In various Arab League countries and in Egypt, inclusion can be an elusive concept in many ways. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you see as part of the solution package. Is the Egyptian government willing and able to be more inclusive? Like, what's worked and what hasn't in the parliamentary structure? But more importantly, like, what do you see as part of the solution structure? Is it a government state advocacy campaign? Is it people-to-people inclusion along the lines that Farhnaz is suggesting? I wonder if you can expand on that, either in the kind of pan-Arab League context or in the Egypt case specifically.
Thank you, George. I think all the points raised are important ones and need to be addressed by governments that are serious and willing to deal with these problems in their countries. And the important point here is that these governments need to realize that they're losing something because of these politics. ICANN highlighted the benefits for the regimes and the population, the pillage, all of this, but there's also a price being paid. Pakistan would not have Muhammad Abdul Salam had it not, if these policies that are maintained today were maintained at his time and excluding him. Egypt would lose so many people that have, I mean, this country has benefited so much from immigrants, from people coming from the Middle East. I can go on and list all those successful Egyptians, Christians in America that Egypt has lost, that it's not benefiting from. We don't have an actor like Rami Malek. America has him today. So these governments need to realize that their policies are bad for them, and not just because of religious freedom issues. These are threatening their own progress and development. In terms of policies to be followed and done to deal with this problem, I think legal issues are very important. We need to find a solution to these blasphemy laws and to stop them from being implemented against religious minorities and against anyone in any case. But I would really start with education. Farhnaz talked about people aren't born hating the other, they're taught. The educational system is very important here. It's not just the modern minorities that are excluded, it's the past as well. If Egyptian kids are taught nothing about the history of their own country, when it was a Christian country, about the contributions of religious minorities of today, who were a majority in the past, to their own country's development, it's no surprise that they would grow not feeling that these people belong to their countries in the first place. It's no surprise that Muslim kids in Egypt who grew up not knowing what a church is, never visiting one, never being taught anything about Christianity or about the people they share the country with, would believe so many superstitions and conspiracy theories about Coptic priests wearing black because they're sad that Islam controls Egypt, or that churches, black magic is practiced inside churches in Egypt, and the proof is Coptic text, a weird language that must mean black magic. All of these things emerge because there's an absence in the educational system. There's a huge gap that is then filled by the agents of hate, by those doing the incitement. So I think I would start really with the educational system, with introducing the others that live with you in the country, their contributions, and why it's important to have them. But I'd also introduce, in a sense, the world to them. From my experience growing up in Egypt and going through the Egyptian educational system, we're really not taught anything about the whole world. It's a complete enigma. It's no surprise then that the world is then painted as conspiring against us, as our enemy. We need to be taught the history of civilizations, of religions, the same they do in Western countries, just to learn about the other, to explain that no, not everyone has to be exactly the same. And that pluralism is really, in addition, is something that has contributed, is the foundation of the whole world's development, and not something that we need to crush under this guise of we all need to be like each other and we all need to be one.
So thank you so much for that, Sam. So Icon, here's the challenge I will pose to you. Farhnaz introduced the concept, the theory of inclusion and why and how it should be applied. Sam introduced some practical context through the education system, the mere introduction of the vocabulary through which practically inclusion can be achieved, or at least start to introduced into a learning population, into the learning environment in a specific country. I wonder if you could continue with this theme of kind of practical tools, practical applications, other theories, whether it's inclusion, partnerships, exchanges, educational themes, vocabulary, other themes or topics that you think can be tools or resources to challenging the threats of majoritarianism that you and the other panelists have outlined.
Thank you, George. There's so much I agree with what Farhnaz and Sam just said. I could just re-echo them for the rest of today. But let me try to echo some of their messaging. First of all, Farhnaz repeatedly talked about laws and social mechanisms. So I think that's that comment has so much wisdom in it that coupling the two together is very important. That is, as a former lawmaker who co-drafted Turkey's first hate crimes bill, I know that laws are very important, but that's not where it ends, right? Implementation is so important. And ultimately, you can't fix hate just by laws, even if you have robust implementation. That's just the beginning. And I think that's why Farhnaz several times mentioned social mechanisms. You really need to have, beyond the domain of jurisprudence, other social and cultural mechanisms, whether it's interfaith dialogue, whether it's a culture of civility, whether it's, again, a robust civil society that complements political and legal processes. And then when it comes to education, and I think Sam really hit the nail there when he said it's not just about also today, it's about the past as well. So in many of these South Asian and Middle Eastern societies, victims of majoritarianism, whether it's the members of the majority or the minority, lack the ability to fully study a past in which all faiths, ethnicities, cultures are represented. And so one part of this equation is, of course, an inclusive education that teaches not only tolerance, but more importantly, embrace of diversity. The sense that this is in itself something valuable, that losing diversity, losing pluralism is a major cost. Again, and a very important theme that Sam mentioned, that there might be some narrow self-interest in majoritarianism, in discrimination, in pillaging of minority resources, but overall you lose, meaning the sum total of such selfish moves is that everyone loses, that all these societies are in fact impoverished, are kind of riddled with corruption, with moral bankruptcy as well. But at the same time, I would like to flip the education coin because there is also a set of practices that should be stopped. That is, in most of these countries, the education system works as a mechanism through which hate is inculcated. And that inculcation of hate and prejudice, mainly against minorities, and it can be religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities, that complements the systematic propagation of hate and prejudice by what I call brokers of hate, by politicians, by state officials who build their careers on such propagation of hate. So, which brings us then to the real difficult task of how to operationalize an education system, which on the one hand does not inculcate hate, and which on the other hand instead teaches pluralism, diversity, values of embrace of the other, and also inspires in the students an inclusive, pluralistic future in which people can improve themselves, not by, eyeing what their neighbors have, not by pillaging and looting what minorities have, but by joining forces with others for the common good. In fact, the idea of a public good is often extremely eroded in such majoritarian, hyper-centralized, and authoritarian contexts. Like this notion of, although there is always a talk, a rhetoric around, the national will, or the ummah and the nation, there is always this communitarian language, but in fact, there is no public good. It's an extremely selfish, homo homini lupus kind of a setting. Really, the laws of the jungle often apply in such contexts. So I think, again, the task we have at hand is this gradual evolution towards a rules-based system, the rule of law and due process and civility and diversity. So it's a long continuum from the constitutions and laws to the values and personal relationships. I know the task is really huge, but the harmonious workings of our very own task force across different faiths, ethnicities, nationalities, I think itself living proof that if there is a will, there is a way.
There's a way. Well said. Icon, thank you for sharing those thoughts. Farhnaz, Sam, and Icon, if you'll indulge me for just a couple more minutes, I would like to propose that we do a very quick lightning round in the time we have remaining on two important questions that have kind of popped up. And for those of you that have questions, just a quick reminder to please go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll get to them. The first kind of lightning round question that I'd like to each just spend a minute on is on the subject of anti-Semitism, something that ADL is focused on combating and analyzing and studying on a day-to-day basis. So, and the second question is going to be on the role of technology and artificial intelligence moving forward. So, Farhnaz, if I can start with you on the lightning round here on the subject of anti-Semitism. In calendar year 2022, ADL recorded the largest number of anti-Semitic incidents in the history of the United States over the course of the past 40 plus years. While those numbers are relevant to the continental United States, we know that globally, the numbers of anti-Semitic incidents are equally, if not more troubling in Southeast Asia, across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. And so as you think about the corrosive factors of majoritarianism, how, if at all, does anti-Semitism play a role in the ills of majoritarianism? I wonder if you can describe how you viewed the role and context of anti-Semitism in the book, and Sam and Icon, same question for you in the context in which you can share with our audience. So just a minute each. Farhnaz, over to you to kick us off.
Well, I talk broadly, I think, about the Muslim world and how much the Muslim world has lost from the time of the three major Abrahamic faiths, which started with Judaism, and then, obviously Christianity and Islam coming about. And in every country that you see that anti-Semitism occurs, the Jews are the number one victim of persecution that I have witnessed globally, and not just in my lifetime. Definitely not just in Pakistan, not just in Muslim majority countries outside of the Middle East, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, etc., countries with massive populations, but also in the Middle East. And this Jews seem to be the first population. For example, in Pakistan, the last synagogue was, demolished by bulldozers in the 80s by a Islamist military dictator. And after that time, Islamization as a way of life, a system of government, education, it came into all forms. And so it's a major issue. And I feel that once you start seeing, I used to say this a lot in our ADL meetings, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It is the first sign that something is very wrong with the polity.
Thank you for that, Farhanaz. Sam, stick with that theme for a second. Anti-Semitism as being the canary in the coal mine, the first scapegoat. Agree, disagree? How do you see the view of anti-Semitism? You referenced this earlier in the context of some of the history of dictatorship in Egypt. What role, if at all, does anti-Semitism play in the complexities and the challenges of majoritarianism?
Definitely. I think anti-Semitism was not just a means of hate or a politics of hate, but in a sense was the foundation of a lot of these regimes. It was the foundation of the totalitarian project in the Middle East. Now, today, of course, I don't know whether to call it thankfully or sadly, we've run out of Jews to persecute in our countries. There are 6 Jews left in Egypt, and the youngest is in her late 60s. Soon, Egypt is going to be Judenfrei. Many of these countries in the region have become completely out of Jews. Again, thankfully, sadly, they can't persecute them physically. But this has not stopped anti-Semitism from continuing to be a foundation of politics in the region. I remember after the military coup in Egypt in 2013, both sides of the equation disagreed on everything in the world, except that the Jews were to blame. So either it was President Sisi was a Jew in secret and his mother was a Moroccan Jew, or the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, was in fact Jewish. When you have both sides that are fighting, that are killing each other, agreeing on this only one thing, you realize how important it is to the politics of the region, where you find both the regimes and their opposition both on the same page regarding this issue. Now, thankfully, there has been, this time really thankfully, there has been some progress in the region in many countries, especially the UAE, Morocco, those that became part of the Abrahamic Accords, Bahrain, others. These countries have adopted a different attitude, not just refraining from encouraging anti-Semitism within their countries, but also partnering with ADL in the center in the UAE to deal with this problem of hatred and intolerance in the region. On the other hand, because of the political dynamic in the region, we have their competitors often using anti-Semitism as a means of undermining these regimes. So whether it is Qatar and its political fights with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Turkey as well, other countries, playing the card of anti-Semitism in order to undermine support for people like MBS and MBZ.
Thank you for sharing that. So Sam shared many important points as it relates to the corrosive effect and both the historical context for anti-Semitism, Jew-hating, whatever label we want to put on it. I wonder if you can share some context on the role of anti-Semitism as you see it as part of the complexity as responding to or advocating against majoritarianism and the ill effects of it. And before we conclude, my colleague and co-chair Marjan, I'd like to invite you back on to share kind of any concluding thoughts or topics on this subject as well. But Icon, let me turn it over to you to start, and then I'll turn it over to Marjan to see if she has any concluding thoughts or comments. Icon, over to you.
So I do agree that anti-Semitism is almost like the archetypal hate in the Middle East and South Asia, after which many other forms of hate were built. Just to give you a concrete example, many forms of Sunni majoritarianism in the region often go after what they see as non-conforming Muslim minorities, such as, the Shiite communities or the Alevi communities, often portraying them within anti-Semitic theories, often claiming that they came out from the Sunni community because of some, Jewish conspiracy. And in fact, other forms of hate that feed into majoritarianism, again, build on this hate, this archetypal hate that is anti-Semitism. And I agree with Sam that even when many of these countries no longer have either sizable or any Jewish individuals to speak of, they still sustain their regimes on anti-Semitic hate. Like the fact that there is now only one Jewish individual in Yemen and in prison under the wardenship of the Iranian proxy Houthi militia does not end anti-Semitic hate coming from Yemen. In fact, even when that last Jew is hopefully freed one day and is out of the country, it will continue, which shows us that this is a lasting form of hate that will outlive the Jewish communities in these countries. And again, I agree that the only way to reverse this trend, this decades long, if not centuries and millennia long trends in the region, is to start building some people-to-people ties as complementary strategies to the Abraham Accords. Because Abraham Accords, I agree with Sam, that was really an important first step. Unblocking some of the political and legal obstacles. But it's really important that it's complemented by strong people-to-people ties. And in fact, that's what ADL is now trying to do also with the Manara Center in Abu Dhabi, that we have generations that do not build their political imagination on hate and anti-Semitism, but on the very intimate personal knowledge of Jewish individuals from the region or beyond, that they can begin to humanize people they have been taught all their lives to demonize. So I think that's really the step forward, humanization of the people who have been demonized all along.
Thank you, Icon. Marjan, if I may, in our concluding minutes here, you and I and this task force has spoken extensively both about assessments as we see threats to minority communities, both across the Middle East and elsewhere across the globe. And I wonder if you can just share some concluding thoughts on the role in which bodies like this and different advocacy platforms based in the US and elsewhere can do to help elevate and really illuminate the problems and the persecution that minority communities are facing, and the importance through which this type of persistent advocacy needs to be part and parcel of what civil societies are really doing across the globe. I think the Iranian American community is a perfect example of that, but your kind of concluding thoughts on the importance of this type of work.
Thank you, George, and thank you for facilitating and moderating today's conversation. I think we all learned a tremendous amount from the wisdom and experiences of our experts here. I think much of what has been discussed really will play into our future solutions, and the roles of institutions and entities such as the task force and the ADL at large, and many of the think tanks and other entities that we are involved with, as well as those of you in the audience who are joining us. I think everyone really can make a difference. On an individual level, remember what Farnaz said about hate being learned. And if something is learned, it can also be unlearned. And use the teachable moments on a one-on-one, people-to-people capacity. You don't always need to have a big institution behind you to do people-to-people work. But challenge a stereotype and educate your peers and educate yourself about lesser known communities, and use those teachable moments. And also broadening the perspective, pulling back the lens. I think we need to continue to speak out whenever we see injustices, and we need to affirm our role as advocates and outspoken leaders within our levels of platforms and other opportunities that we can have to raise awareness, and not fall into the challenge or the pitfall of who is more victimized, and who is the competitive victimization is something that we want to avoid, and we want to recognize and call out prejudice and hate whenever it happens, wherever it happens. And lastly, yes, of course, we want to do no harm and protect the lives of individuals and protect the safety and well-being of the minority communities wherever they reside. But also, we should pay attention to those warning signs, as Icon mentioned, the way they are determined to erase the cultural capital and the cultural heritage of those minority communities. When they begin with erasing those, they will definitely continue to increase their assaults in a more serious way. Remember that the last synagogue, as Farnaz mentioned, in Pakistan was eradicated in 1980s. That is not a long time ago. Many of, could it have been avoided? And what can we do to preserve the cultures that remain in other countries, those endangered cultures and societies? That's my addition to the discussion.
Such an important point that as we refer to the 80s, it was not ancient history. It was in our lifetimes, at least many of us, myself included. So thank you for that reminder, Marjan. Farnaz, I'd like to turn it over to you for the final thought before my colleague Tuba helps close us out. The book is The Politics of Hate, Religious Majoritarianism in South Asia and in the Middle East. We're so thankful for your scholarship, for your body of work, and for your contributions to organizations and groups like ours and elsewhere. Farnaz, over to you to share your final thoughts on the book and these themes before we conclude today's program.
My final thoughts are basically, for those of us who are or live in countries like the United States, where we have known safety, where we pray, where we live, where we don't pray, where we choose to practice whatever way of life that we choose. We have to get very serious within the United States with, organizations like ADL, but other organizations, that we have to come together, because there's a threat to democracy all over the world from the politics of hate. And you'll see Putin supporting Erdogan. Now, they have nothing in common except the politics of hate and majoritarianism, which they both use. You see the same thing in Iran, you see the same. It is a growing phenomenon. But I feel that in the United States and in Western Europe, people still don't want to talk about religion and ethnic communities. It still makes the left, people on the left feel uncomfortable. And the people on the right, a lot of the time, only want to protect their own communities. We have to be bigger than that. We have to be better than that. And we have to really activate everyone around us and try and create more and more vessels and vehicles. There is so much richness out there. I have met recently so many Iraqi Jews, and they speak in Arabic. The way they eat, the way they dress, everything about them, even though they had to flee Iraq decades ago, lifetimes ago, they still consider themselves of the region, and they are. These are all the people we have to bring together and have their voices heard in the US and all over Western Europe. The UN, I'm sorry, I have almost no faith in the UN, so I won't even mention it here.
Well, we'll end on an optimistic note. We'll end on an optimistic note, Farhnaz.
Yes. The optimism is that we can all galvanize others to do the right thing for everyone.
I certainly believe in that. Farhnaz, thank you for sharing your concluding thoughts with us. We're excited for the launch of this book, and thank you for this contribution. Sam and Icon, thank you also for participating in this conversation. To my colleague and co-chair, Marjan, thank you for helping share your thoughts and feedback in this important conversation. And with that, Tuba, can you help close us out, please?
Of course. At this time, our briefing is finished. We'd like to thank all of our presenters and our moderator for an excellent event. Please stay tuned for updates from ADL and from ADL's Task Force on Middle Eastern Minorities. Thank you so much and have a great day.